I'm going to be talking about economics, and because this is probably just a day or two before your actual exam, I'm not going to be talking about long term strategies. And hopefully, this video will help you retain what you already know, because I think you will agree that economics as a subject, even if you know, even if you think you know really well and you've done the syllabus, you've covered the syllabus, if you don't have a very well devised revision plan, and if you rushed through just completing as much of the bulk as possible, when you write the exam you will get the concepts muddled up, because obviously there's a lot of it's a very technical subject, there's a lot of graphs, there's schedules corresponding to all the theories, so it gets a little confusing. So for that I'm just going to be sharing what I did to retain information, because I had my experiences. I went to write exams and I forgot, and then I tried to change my strategies to overcome that. So one of the things that I did, and I suggest that you and yeah, I'll talk about macro first and then move on to Indian economics. Yeah, so one of the things that I suggest you do is, draw the graphs. You just don't just see them, look at them in the book. It's important that you draw the graphs, and even better, draw the graphs, like four on one page. Take the entire syllabus, every single graph in the entire macro syllabus, and just draw it continuously. Like it'll take three pages with I think 4 graphs per page. It'll take 3-4 pages. Draw all of them, and more importantly, if a graph is a particular shape, ask yourself why. Because we are not plotting any of the graphs. It's, I think, very rare that you actually have to plot actual values. Instead, you just have to remember that this graph is upward sloping, it was downward sloping, it was S shaped, and you just draw it from memory. So it's very important to remember why. Obviously, for two reasons. Number one, because you have to write that explanation. It's not enough to draw the graph. You have to give an explanation of the graph. The graph is upward sloping, downward sloping, this is the shape, and you also have to say why that is the shape. So it's usually, for all the graphs, it's usually the marginal quantity, the I think this is getting a little confusing, but in the table, the marginal unit usually determines the shape of the graph. So if that's increasing, the graph is upward sloping. If there's a direct relationship between the variables, it's upward sloping. So that kind of thing. You should know why a graph is the way it is. And not only because you have to write the explanation, but because if you forget what the shape of the graph was, you look at the theory and you look at the table and you can guess and you'll remember them. So that's why it's important to know the minute concepts. Instead of just memorizing that this graph is upward shaped, you should know why. Secondly, the tables, the values in the schedules, I know they can be a little confusing, but unlike the graphs which you don't actually have to plot, tables you cannot really wing them. I strongly suggest that you try to memorize those values as far as possible. And even if you can't, if you cannot remember the exact value, you should remember, the progression of it. If it's going from 0 to 1, if it's going from 1 to 0, how it's increasing, if it's decreasing, if it gets constant, when is it 0? Because there are a lot of technicalities to it. When one column is at its max, the other is at 0. And if you just try to, make that up during your exam, you might not be able to. So either try to remember the concept very well, that this graph is in the table, the values are increasing, they're decreasing. I think, I'm not sure if you have this in macroeconomics, but in micro there are also graphs in which first it's increasing at an increasing rate, then at a decreasing rate. So yeah, it's very confusing. So I think it's better that you should, actually memorize the values that come with the book instead of trying to wing it during the exam. Secondly, a very good strategy that it was taught to me by one of my teachers. So it was that we have 6 markers in economics, right? So almost all of these are a combination of 6 things. You start an answer by giving an introduction, if there are any definitions, then those. Number two, if there are any assumptions, you write your assumptions. Number three, you write the schedule. Number four, you write your graph. Number five, you explain all of it. And often there is a sixth component which is different for all your graphs. So I do have my book here. I'll see if I can find that particular. Yeah. So this is a 6 marker sticky note that I stuck. I'm not sure if you can see this very clearly, but here I have the 6 pointers that I would use if a 6 marker comes for this particular concept. And it is what I said, it's definitions, assumption, diagram, schedule, explanation. And for this particular one, the sixth point is what happens when AD and AS, that is aggregate demand and supply, are not equal. So these are the 6 points, and if you have it organized in this way, it's very easy to revise, and you'll have a 6 marker all prepared, and you won't have to sit in the exam hall and actually prepare your answer. You know it very well. It comes across as very organized to the invigilator as well. Now next, the thing, numericals. Now honestly, I avoided numericals like anything. I would not study them because numericals usually come as a option to theory, or they have an option within themselves, like for calculation of national income, the methods come as an option to themselves. So I would just do one and I would be like, this is the one I'm doing and I'm not touching anything else, because I wanted to avoid numericals. But more often than not, I would end up doing the numerical questions while giving the exam, because the theory questions are very unpredictable. They can be anything. But numericals, if you know it, it's probably going to be right. So I suggest that you, even if you think that you're going to attempt the theory question and not the numerical, please do know how to do the numerical, because there's a very good chance that the theory question will be a little tricky, but numericals are usually very predictable and they just come, it'll be what you've studied and not a surprise. Yeah, probable questions. So I think in every chapter there is, that one big 6 marker that will come. So that is something that you should really do, instead of trying to just rereading the chapters with no kind of aim. At this juncture, you should, every chapter that you look at, it should be from the point of view of what can be asked. And that is why I have sticky notes. I wanted to organize my answers, because obviously there is a lot of information, and even more so in Indian economics than in macro, often answers will be an amalgamation of all the information that you gather throughout chapters. And it's important that you concise it, you bring it together in a sticky note and put it there, that if a question comes, this is what I'm going to write, because it's difficult to structure it during exams. And what happens is, you will write an answer, you will put all the information there, but examiners do not read through all of it. So if your answer has a structure, if it has subheadings, if it has diagrams, it just makes it look a lot better to the examiner as well. And you don't have to waste a lot of time thinking how to write this answer, how to begin it, how to end it, what all content should be in there. There's a good chance you will miss certain parts of the chapter if you just try to write it during the exams. So yeah, make sticky notes of probable answers, just and paste them in the book. I did not use my notes for these tiny sticky notes that I put in my book, because I was in the habit of underlining and highlighting instead of writing. I did not maintain a single copy for any of the subjects that I have. But obviously, whatever works for you, you should not be changing your strategy according to what anybody tells you last minute. So that's microeconomics. That's macroeconomics, and do these sticky note things. They really help organize your answers. That is the best thing that I can tell you one day before your exam. Okay, so moving on to Indian economic development, please do not underestimate it. I know we place more emphasis on macro because obviously it's the technical part of it. It's what takes. It's very conceptual. It takes time to understand and it's vast. But so is Indian economic development. Often at the time of exams, I found myself struggling the morning before to just remember. Like, I'm not talking about like a final exam, which we did not have. But even during like boards and half yearlies, I mostly focused on macro and kind of ended up ignoring Indian economic development. And in the later part of studying, I did not make that mistake because obviously it carries this equal number of marks, so it doesn't make sense that you would ignore it. I'm not saying that you should devote equal time to macro and Indian economic development. I'm just saying that you should do it its due diligence. Do not take it for granted. Don't think that you will be able to attempt just wing whatever comes up, because that doesn't happen. So, the biggest thing for Indian economic development is flowcharts, because it's very vast. I think for any theory subjects, flowcharts are very, very important. It's better when it's usually for this IED, everything is already divided into points. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 labeled in the book. But when there's not, you need to make your own points. You need to frame an answer like this is the first point, this is the second point, this is the third point. You need to be able to do that, and it's very important to be able to recognize. Like I think this applies to all subjects. It's very important to be able to recognize that this has three very distinct points. This can be a 3 marker. This has a lot of information. This can be a 6 marker. So it's very important to recognize that and form your answers that way, especially for theory subjects. So flowcharts, yeah. I'll take the example of LPG here. Suppose the question is just about globalization. It helps if you draw a flowchart in the exam that shows, it's like uh, this, and you don't have to talk about LPG, all three of them, but you draw a flowchart that says liberalization, privatization, globalization. You list the points under those two as well. Then go on to elaborate about globalization. So it just shows the examiner that you know your content, and obviously it adds a little extra. It takes up half of a page, so it makes your answer seem bigger, and you do want that in your theory subjects. That's not to say that you should write random stuff. It's just that it's a good thing if it happens. So flowcharts, yeah, and if there are like 5 points, subheadings, you definitely do subheadings, but also do that diagram. Even if you're going to talk about 5 of them in 5 different paragraphs, also make a flowchart. It makes your presentation different, it makes your paper stand out. So, and this is not just for IIT, this is for all subjects. I followed this rigorously for political theory, political science as well, because it just makes your presentation a lot better. And once I started doing it, I kind of started doing it for every answer, and it's genuinely a really good thing. It makes your answer look more organized, and it makes your paper stand out. Next, while I will say that please do not skip out on reading the theory chapters, if at this point you have not read them very thoroughly, do the key points to remember thing that's at the end of every chapter in Sandeep Card. Know the subheadings. If you know 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the subheadings, maybe you will be able to elaborate upon them if you have to attempt that question. Absolutely, because I know, like, you always plan that I'm not going to attempt the question from this chapter, or this is not important, this is not going to come, but then it ends up on your paper and you have to attempt it. In that case, it's better to not be completely clueless, even if you don't know. Exactly what was the content inside. A lot of the times you can make it up. If you remember the subheading, you can elaborate on it. IED is a lot. Um, you know a lot of it even before studying the subject, so there's a good chance that you'll be able to make up the answers if you remember the subheadings. So the key points to remember, don't just go through them. Make sure that if that is all you are doing and you're skipping the chapter at the end, please do them very thoroughly. Make sure that you have the points memorized, and you can write a 5 marker from that if it ever comes. uh, Next, yeah, so data figures. ID, very theoretical. It's mostly just, paragraph after paragraph. What will make you different what will make you, not let the examiner cut that point 0.5, because in theory subjects it's all about, there's uh, it's difficult to just nail it. It's difficult to get 6 out of 6. Examiners will give you 5.5, they'll give you 5 even if you've technically done nothing wrong. You have to ensure that your answer is so good that the examiner will not deduct that point 0.5. So one thing was drawing of the flowcharts. Second thing, subheadings. Third thing, there are a lot of data figures that we tend to just skim over. Okay, so there's just a random statistic there that 53% of the population, something, something, and we tend to skip over that. But don't try to remember 2 or 3 statistics for, very important statistics that you think you will be able to use in your answer. Try to use that, because like I said, it makes you stand out from other papers that examiners are checking. Next, another thing that I hope you still have that, because we did, was analysis of graphs. So this is another thing where you will need your data figures, and you will have to understand why something is the way it is. So analysis of graphs, they'll give you a graph about something related to the Indian economy, and you will have to analyze it. Now that does not simply mean that kind of point out that this graph is going up, literacy went up, or female literacy is lower than male literacy. You do not just write what's in the graph. You have to write that, absolutely you have to, but that's not all. That will give you like 3 marks out of 5. You also have to include your own analysis. That is, why, if the graph is showing an upward trend, why? Now, how will you do that? Usually, you will find that when you read the chapter. You will find that, in 1990s, suppose there was a particular policy that was launched towards literacy, and you see a graph that the literacy is going up. So you have to use that. You have to use that this particular policy was launched, and that could be a reason for the increased trend. So that's analyzing graphs. And the last thing that I want to say is about presentation. Although I have covered it, the things that I suggest the most, try to make it in points. If you don't have the time to, write entire paragraphs, try to make it in points. Try to include as much information as possible. Like I said, if the question is about from LPG, only about privatization, do mention LPG as a flowchart so that the examiner knows that you have a lot of content to talk about. Subheadings, try to use as many graphs, as many charts. Try to break up your answers. Don't let it be a mass of text that the examiner has to decipher. Make it into points, make it into subheadings, enter data in there. Just make it very, very organized. Uh, Make a paper that you are proud to read through at the end, because that's something that I loved to do. When I put in that extra effort, I put in flowcharts. When I used to skim through my paper at the very end, I used to know that this is something that will fetch me good marks. So that is all. Best of luck, and yeah.